Jerusalem. Night. The month of Nisan, the first month of the Hebrew calendar, was almost over. It was late. The city slept under a moonless sky, and a young man awoke to the sound of footsteps outside, too fast, too heavy. He peered out the window and saw torches moving down the street, the orange light cutting through the darkness, soldiers marching towards the Mount of Olives. Something was wrong. He knew that road. He knew where they were going, and he knew who was there. Without stopping to think, without time to dress properly, the young man wrapped a linen sheet around his body and ran. He ran down the sloping cobblestone street, past closed doors, and out through the city gates as the cold morning wind lashed his face. His feet pounded urgently on the ground, the soldiers' torches already visible in the distance in the dark garden. He arrived too early or too late. There was no way to know. Jesus was already surrounded. Swords had already been drawn. In the midst of the confusion, someone saw the young man. A hand grabbed him by the shoulder, and he did the only thing he could. He dropped the sheet and ran naked through the early morning, leaving the fabric in the soldier's hands, disappearing into the darkness. This scene appears in only one of the four Gospels. No other evangelist mentions it. It serves no narrative purpose. It explains nothing about Jesus. It has no apparent theological purpose. It is simply the story of a frightened young man who fled naked from a garden. Why then did anyone write it? Many theologians throughout the centuries have answered this question in the same way, because the one who wrote it was there, because that young man was the author himself. A hidden signature in the middle of the gospel, too small for most to notice, too large to be forgotten by those who understand it. If this theory is correct, and it has over 1,800 supporters for years, then that boy who fled naked from a garden in Jerusalem on the night the world seemed to end would be the same person who years later would pick up a pen and write the story of Jesus so that it would never be forgotten. A man who knew fear, who felt the cold of the stone on his bare feet, who ran when he should have stayed, and yet it changed the world. His name was John Mark, and this is the story of how an imperfect young man, who failed when it mattered most, became the author of the most urgent gospel ever written and the founder of Christianity across Africa. Around the year 10 BC, somewhere in the Mediterranean world, a child was born who received two names. It was customary among Jews living under the Roman Empire to have two names, a Hebrew name for the parents' faith, John, a Roman name for the world around them, Mark. This boy would grow up carrying both worlds within him, and perhaps that is why he could speak to both. His mother's name was Mary, not the mother of Jesus, but an equally remarkable woman. She was Jewish, from the tribe of Levi, probably a widow, and the owner of one of the largest houses in Jerusalem, a house that was not just a dwelling, it was a meeting place. It was where the first Christians gathered to pray, eat together and listen to the stories of those who had seen Jesus. Church tradition holds that it was in this house that Jesus celebrated the Last Supper with his apostles on the night before he died, and that it was in this same house that, 50 days later, the Virgin Mary and the disciples were gathered when the Holy Spirit descended upon them in tongues of fire on the day we call Pentecost. This is tradition. It is not proven documentarily, but it has endured through 20 centuries of faith. What is documented in the Bible is this: one night, the Apostle Peter was miraculously freed from prison by an angel and went straight to that house. Acts of the Apostles, chapter 12, verse 12 records, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John called Mark, where many were gathered together praying. Peter knew that the Christians of Jerusalem would be there. That house was the heart of the nascent church. Young Marcos grew up in this environment. From an early age, he saw apostles going up and down the stairs of that house. He heard stories about Jesus told by those who had touched him, healed him, followed him. He breathed the air of a faith that was still warm, still pulsating, still smelling of the wood from shared meals. His cousin, some say nephew, was Barnabas, who would become one of the Apostle Paul's closest traveling companions. This family connection would place Mark at the center of everything that was happening. He was not one of the 12 apostles. He was never presented as such. But he knew almost all of them personally. There was something extraordinary about being that boy at that time and in that place. The gospel was happening live in his living room. The church was being founded in the nightly meetings his mother organized, and he witnessed it all, absorbing, retaining, without yet knowing what purpose it would serve. But there's no guarantee that growing up in the center means staying in the center. Marcos would learn this the hard way. Around the year 44, Paul and Barnabas were in Jerusalem on an apostolic mission, and they decided to take the young Mark with them. It was an extraordinary opportunity, the first great missionary journey the church had ever organized. Two of the most important men in the Christian movement setting out together to take the gospel to the nations. And Mark, Barnabas's cousin, was chosen to accompany them. They set off for Cyprus. The sea was blue, the wind was warm, and young Mark must have felt something akin to euphoria. They preached throughout the island, from Salamis to Paphos, where they even converted the Roman governor of the region. It was thrilling, it was transformative. The world seemed to open up. After Cyprus, Paul announced his next destination, the interior of Asia Minor, what is now Turkey, among pagan populations who had never heard of Jesus, in much more difficult, much more dangerous, much more uncertain terrain. And right there, at that moment, Marcos said no. The book of Acts records the event without explanation. John left them and returned to Jerusalem. Period. No stated reason, no justification. He simply left when the mission became more difficult. What went through Mark's mind at that moment? Fear, homesickness, doubt about the mission? The Bible doesn't say. And perhaps that's for the best, because the silence about the reason makes the story more human. How many times do we give up on something important without being able to explain exactly why? The problem was what happened next. When Paul and Barnabas returned from their journey, they planned a second mission. Barnabas wanted to take Mark again. Paul refused, firmly. The biblical text in Acts chapter 15, verses 36 to 39, describes such a great disagreement between the two that it ended up breaking their partnership. Paul and Barnabas, who had traveled together for years, separated because of Mark. Barnabas went with his cousin to Cyprus. Paul chose another companion and went on from there. Marcos was left carrying the weight of it all. He was the reason why two giants of faith had fought. He was the young man who had abandoned the mission. He was the one who wasn't up to the task. In Jerusalem, during the months and years that followed, the silence surrounding Mark must have been heavy. He who had grown up in the house where the church was born, who had known all the apostles, who had been chosen for a historic mission, and who had returned home. But sometimes the person who has failed the most is precisely the one God hasn't finished using yet. There was an apostle in Rome who was about to send a message. Rome was the city that swallowed the world. 7 hills, 1 million inhabitants, the smell of fresh bread wafting from bakeries at dawn, and the constant clatter of carts on the cobblestone streets. Amidst this turmoil, a small community of Christians grew, meeting secretly in private homes to pray and share what they called breaking bread. That's where Marcos went, and that's where he found Pedro. The relationship between the two is documented in the first letter of Peter, chapter 5, verse 13. "My son Mark greets you," a simple phrase that carries immense weight. Peter, the apostle who had denied Jesus 3 times and then rose to lead the entire church, called Mark his son. Not his assistant, not his collaborator, his son. Something had happened between them that went beyond the mission. A trust built day after day in the noisy streets of Rome, in the nightly meetings of the Christian communities, in the moments when Peter preached and Mark listened with total attention. Because that was Mark's role, to listen, and then to transform what he heard into written words. Peter preached in Aramaic, the language of the Galilean fishermen, but the Christians in Rome spoke Greek. Mark, a cultured and bilingual man, served as an interpreter, someone who not only translated words, but translated worlds. Bishop Papias of Hierapolis, writing around the year 130, recorded, "Mark, Peter's interpreter, wrote down exactly everything he remembered." During those years in Rome, Mark also reconciled with Paul. The apostle who had refused to take him on a second mission now had him close again. Around the year 61, Paul was imprisoned in Rome awaiting trial, and in the letters he wrote from there, he mentioned Mark as a close collaborator. The reconciliation was definitively completed in a letter dated approximately 66, when Paul, imprisoned for the second time and sensing that his end was near, wrote these words to Timothy: "Bring Mark with you, for he may be useful in the ministry." The same man who had said, "I'm not taking this young man," now said, "I need him here." Mark had changed, or perhaps Paul had seen him in a better light. In any case, within a few years, the young man who had abandoned a mission out of fear became indispensable to the two greatest pillars of the first-century church. Peter called him son. Paul wanted him by his side in the most difficult hour. And between these two affections, on those nights in Rome, Marcos began to write. The Christians in Rome had a problem. Peter was there. Paul was there. But the persecutions intensified each year, and anyone could see that those two men wouldn't last forever. What would happen to everything they knew? To the stories they told about Jesus? To the miracles they had witnessed or heard from those who had witnessed them? All of that lived only in the memory and voices of these people, and memories fade, and voices fall silent. The Christians asked Mark to write, and Mark wrote. What emerged between the 1950s and 1960s is the shortest of the four Gospels, and the fastest. There is no genealogy of Jesus, no angels announcing the birth, no long speeches. The Gospel of Mark begins directly with John the Baptist in the desert and doesn't stop. The most repeated word in the entire text is the Greek word meaning immediately. Immediately Jesus did this. Immediately that happened. It's a narrative that rushes, that pushes, that doesn't let the reader stop to breathe. And there was a reason for this urgency. It was all true. Every sermon that Mark transcribed came from the mouth of Peter, who had touched Jesus, fished alongside Jesus, slept in the same boat as Jesus. It wasn't theology constructed in a study, it was testimony, living memory. Peter read the manuscript and approved it. More than that, he ordered it to be read in all the churches. What few realize is the magnitude of this legacy. When Matthew and Luke, some years later, wrote their own Gospels, they used Mark's text as a basis. More than 600 of the 661 verses of the Gospel of Mark appear in some form in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. The text that Mark wrote on those nights in Rome became the backbone of two of the four Gospels that the Church reads to this day. There's a detail that spans centuries and still intrigues scholars. Only the Gospel of Mark contains the story of the young man with the sheet in the Garden of Olives, a scene that serves no purpose, theologically speaking, except to say, I was there. Do you know anyone who has ever hidden their own story within something they created? That detail may be the most discreet and moving signature ever placed on any sacred text. But Marcos wasn't finished yet. Peter and Paul were martyred in Rome, probably in 67 and 68. The church that Mark had seen grow lost its two greatest pillars, and Mark, the young man who had grown up in the heart of it all, was now the living guardian of its memory. It was time to go where no one had yet gone. Alexandria was at that time the second largest city in the known world. Larger than Antioch, larger than Carthage, a worthy rival to Rome in culture and power. Her city of 100 ethnicities, of Greek philosophers and Egyptian priests, of trade routes that reached the heart of Africa and the heart of Asia. The Lighthouse of Alexandria was one of the 7 wonders of the world. The Library of Alexandria was the greatest archive of human knowledge in history, and in that wondrous city, the gospel had not yet arrived. It was there that Mark set off, carrying his manuscript and the memory of everything he had seen and heard. The Coptic tradition, the Christian Church of Egypt, one of the oldest in the world, recounts in detail how it all began. Upon arriving in Alexandria, Mark cut his sandal on a stone in the road. A shoemaker named Annianus saw him injured and went to help him. Mark healed his wounded hand, preached to him about Jesus, and Annianus was baptized. This man, an ordinary shoemaker, the first convert to the gospel in all of Africa, would become the second bishop of Alexandria after Mark. This is Coptic tradition, not a verifiable historical document. But it has endured for 19 centuries within a church that still exists and today has more than 18 million faithful. Mark stayed in Alexandria for approximately 19 years. He preached, baptized, trained leaders, and built communities. He became the first bishop of Alexandria, the first Christian authority on the African continent. He founded what we now call the Coptic Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian communities still functioning in the world. But he didn't just stay in Alexandria. Tradition speaks of journeys through Cyrenaica, ancient Libya, through the Pentapolis, through Thebaid, through regions where the Christian faith had never before arrived. How many today hear the name Mark and know that he was probably the first to bring the gospel to the African continent? That without him, the history of Christianity on that continent would be different. The persecutions began slowly, then escalated. The pagan inhabitants of Alexandria saw their traditional beliefs being abandoned by neighbors and family members who converted to the gospel of Mark. Resentment simmered for years. Sometime between the years 65 and 68, Mark returned to Alexandria after an absence. He found the church grown and consolidated, but he also found a hatred that had matured. And then Easter arrived. It was Easter Sunday. The Alexandrian sun beat down on the city's stones, and Christians gathered to celebrate the resurrection, what they called the breaking of bread, the Mass that would become the center of their faith. The pagans of the city chose that day. They stormed the celebration. They arrested Mark. They tied a rope around his neck and began dragging him through the streets of Alexandria while the city watched. The Acts of Mark, a 4th century document that records the tradition surrounding his death, describes what came next. Mark was thrown into prison, and that night inside the cell, tradition says an angel appeared, brought light to the dark place and spoke words of comfort to him. "Servant of God, your name is written in the book of life and in the number of the saints." Mark is said to have responded peacefully, giving thanks to God. On the morning of April 25th in the year 68, he was martyred. His executioners ordered his body to be burned. They wanted to erase any sign of his presence in the city. But the Christians of Alexandria risked their own lives to rescue the remains of their founder. They took the body to a grotto on the outskirts of the city in a place called Bukoli, and there they buried him with reverence. Anianus, the shoemaker who had been the first convert, took over as the second bishop of Alexandria. The church that Mark had founded not only survived, it continued to grow. In the 5th century, Marcus's remains were taken from Bukoli to a church within the city of Alexandria, where they began to be publicly venerated. He died as he lived, surrounded by faith, serving the gospel he had written. He was around 58 years old. The young man who had fled from a garden naked at dawn, who had abandoned a mission halfway through, who had disappointed Paul and caused the greatest documented conflict among the apostles, this man died without backing down. "I see the heavens opened," is the phrase that tradition places on his lips on the night of his arrest, evoking the last words of the first martyr, Stephen, whom Mark certainly knew. A way of saying that the story continued. That the end of a life was not the end of the gospel. For centuries he lay in Egypt. The city that had killed him kept his remains as sacred relics. But one day, 2 men from a distant city, built on water, would have an idea that would change the history of an entire nation. The year was 828. 760 years had passed since the martyrdom of Mark, and Egypt was under Arab rule. The governor of Alexandria had announced a worrying order. The marbles from the sanctuary of St. Mark would be removed to be used in the construction of a new palace. The Evangelist's tomb was at risk. 2 Venetian merchants trading in Alexandria heard the news. Their names have been preserved by history, Buono da Malamocco and Rustico da Torcello. They were merchants, not soldiers, not priests, ordinary men who made an extraordinary decision to save the Evangelist's remains at any cost. The plan was both audacious and almost comical. First, with the help of the Christian guardians of the sanctuary, who feared for the safety of the relics as much as they did, they replaced Mark's body with that of another martyr, St. Claudia, so that the guards would not notice the absence. Then they carefully wrapped the relics in wicker baskets and covered them with the most effective means of passing through an Islamic checkpoint: cabbage leaves and pork. Islamic religion forbids contact with pork. Any customs officer would refuse to inspect a shipment covered in it. The scene of the customs crossing has survived for centuries and was even immortalized in a mosaic inside St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. Venetian merchants arrive at the checkpoint. The guards approach. One of them begins to lift the thatched roof, and then the merchants shout, "Khanzir, Khanzir!" the Arabic word for pig. The guards step back, cover their noses, and gesture for the merchants to go ahead. The Evangelist left Egypt hidden under pork. The return voyage to Venice was not smooth. A fierce storm threatened to sink the ship in the Mediterranean Sea. Venetian tradition recounts that St. Mark appeared to the sleeping captain, ordering him to lower the sails immediately. The captain awoke, obeyed, and the ship was saved. On January 31, 1828, the ship entered the port of Venice. The city's leader ordered the construction of a basilica to house the relics, and St. Mark replaced St. Theodore as the city's patron saint, an honor that Venice would never return. The winged lion with an open book in its paws, the symbol of Mark, became the emblem of the Republic of Venice, emblazoned on every flag, every building, every ship that sailed from Venetian ports to the world. An entire city came to bear in its coat of arms the identity of a first-century evangelist, but the story of the relics still held an episode that no one had foreseen. 1063. Venice is building a new basilica, larger and more glorious than the previous one. On the day of the consecration, as the priests prepare to transfer the relics of St. Mark to the new altar, they open the place where they should be. They are empty. The relics have disappeared. The city was immersed in prayer. For days and days, masses were celebrated, requests were made, the city never stopped praying. Then, in 1994, during a solemn mass presided over by the leader of Venice, Vitale Fallier, something that Venetian tradition describes with absolute conviction happened. An arm emerged from within one of the basilica's pillars. It was Marcos's arm, revealing where his relics were hidden. Kept inside the pillar itself, invisible for 31 years. This is tradition. There's no way to verify it historically. But for Venice, this event is as real as any recorded fact. The relics were placed in a golden sarcophagus under the high altar of the basilica, where they remain to this day. The history of the relics gained another chapter in the 20th century. In 1968, Pope Paul VI made a remarkable decision. He returned a portion of the relics of St. Mark to the Coptic Church in Cairo, Egypt, the same church that Mark had founded 19 centuries earlier. Today, St. Mark is venerated on 2 continents simultaneously, in the Golden Basilica of Venice and in the great Coptic Cathedral of Cairo. He is the patron saint of notaries, scribes, glaziers, and opticians, professions linked to the written word and vision, to record-keeping and clarity. But there is a mystery linked to the name of Mark that divides scholars to this day, and which the viewer deserves to know honestly. In 1958, Professor Morton Smith of Columbia University claimed to have found in a monastery near Jerusalem a 2nd century letter describing the existence of a second version of the Gospel of Mark, a more profound one, written by the evangelist himself for the exclusive use of advanced Christians in Alexandria, kept secret by the church. The original manuscript disappeared soon after its discovery. No other scholar has been able to analyze it directly. Many experts concluded it was a fraud. Others defend the letter's authenticity. The Catholic Church does not recognize the text. The debate remains alive and unresolved. This is not a confirmed historical fact. It is an academic controversy that, true or not, shows how the name of Mark still provokes, still intrigues, still moves the world of scholars a millennium and a half after his death. How many people today seek something deeper in faith and don't realize that the gospel they already hold in their hands contains more than they imagine? You began this story with a boy running naked through the early morning hours in Jerusalem, dropping a sheet into the hands of a soldier. He was frightened. He was imperfect. He was someone who had been in the right place at the right time, in the heart of the nascent church, in the house where apostles gathered, and who, when the moment came to prove what he was made of, fled. First from a garden, then from an apostolic mission. 2 escapes, 2 failures that history could have used to erase him completely. But history did otherwise. That boy with the sheet became the man who wrote the first gospel. The text he produced during Roman nights alongside Peter became the foundation upon which two other evangelists built theirs. When the church reads Matthew or Luke on Sunday, it is largely reading words that originated from the hand of Mark. He brought the gospel to a city that was then the intellectual center of the world, and the church he founded in Alexandria still exists, with 18 million faithful, 2,000 years later. The Coptic Church, the Church of the Egyptian Copts, is so named in part because Mark chose to go there when he could have remained safely anywhere else in the empire. His relics traveled an impossible path, from the tomb in Alexandria to the belly of a ship laden with pork, from the ports of Venice to a golden pillar of a basilica, from the pillar to a golden sarcophagus, and from Venice back to Cairo, returned by Pope Paul VI to the church that Mark had founded. Two continents venerate them simultaneously. And then there's the mystery, the version of the gospel that may or may not exist, the young man with the sheet who may or may not have been him, the questions that the name of Mark still raises after almost 2,000 years. This is perhaps what makes Mark different from the other evangelists. Matthew was a converted tax collector. Luke was a physician and a precise writer. John was the beloved disciple, the closest to Jesus. Mark was the one who fled, who disappointed, who returned home when the path became difficult. And that's precisely why his story is for everyone. When someone opens the Gospel of Mark in the middle of a difficult night, they are being reached by someone who has known doubt. When someone who has failed rises again, it is Mark's story that resonates beneath the surface. The unassuming signature in verse 51 of chapter 14, that nameless young man wrapped in a sheet, is the signature of a man who chose to be honest about who he was. Imperfect, courageous, indispensable. Saint Mark, pray for us.